A two-dimensional array looks like a table. It has both rows and columns. A two-dimensional array that has m rows and n columns is called an m by n array, and these are called its dimensions. So for example, this is a 2 by 3 array where we have 2 rows and 1, 2, 3 columns. So again, the indices are usually either going to start at 0 or at 1. If the indices start at 1, then these are the first 2 rows and these are the 3 columns. So we use the indices to refer to elements. So here's an example of a two-dimensional array variable called quiz. In this case, we have 5 rows and 1, 2, 3 columns. So this is a 5 by 3 array. So for example, this might represent quiz scores for some students. The 5 here might be 5 different students, and then 1, 2, 3 different quiz scores for each of the 5 students. So we store them in a two-dimensional array because they're all the same type. In this case, they're all integers, and they represent in some sense the same thing. So every one of these numbers is a quiz grade. So we use the indices, or the subscripts, to refer to an element. So let's say, for example, we wanted to refer to this location. So we're going to give the name of the variable, and then in some kind of brackets or parentheses, let's say it's square brackets, we're going to give first the index for the row, in this case 4, and then the index for the column, in this case 3. So again, if the indices start at 1, then this location is going to be quiz sub 4, the row index first, sub 3, the column index next. So again, we have here the row index and then the column index. So that's how you refer to an individual element in a two-dimensional array. Now, when we have a two-dimensional array, we're going to have 2 counted loops in order to iterate or loop through all of the elements in the array. So if we have the number of rows in an array variable, let's say the array variable generically is called ARR. We store the number of rows in a variable row. We store the number of calls in a variable calls. Then we're going to have 2 counted loops. So we're going to have 2 loop or iterator variables. I is going to go through all of the values for the row indices from 1 to row, and j is going to go through all of the values of all the column indices. So for example, we might say I goes for all the values from 1 to row, and we're going to repeat for every value of I, and what we're going to repeat is looping through all of the columns by having j go from 1 to calls and doing something with our array variable sub I comma j. So again, using the loop variable over the rows first and then the loop variable over the columns second, we're going to use these loop or iterator variables I and j to index into our counted loop. Sorry, to index into our array using the nested counted loop. Okay, so that's very important. We're looping over the rows, we're looping over the columns, so we have a nested counted loop in order to get to every element in the array. Okay, so do we want to go through this two-dimensional array row by row or column by column? Well, it depends on what you want to do. So again, if this represents the students and these are different quizzes, so we have 5 students and 3 quizzes, we might want to go through row by row if we wanted to calculate the sum in order to calculate an average, for example, for every student, or we might want to go through column by column if we wanted to calculate the sum, for example, to calculate the average for every quiz. So it depends on what you want to do. All right, so let's say we want to do something for every row, which is for every student. So in that case, the outer loop has to be over the rows. So I is going to iterate through all of the values of the row indices, and we're going to repeat for every value of I. So the outer loop here is over the rows. Now what we want is a sum for every row. So we need to initialize a sum variable to 0 for every row. So for every row, initialize a sum to 0, and then we're going to add all of those numbers together For example, for our variable quiz, using quiz sub I, comma j, again the loop variable of the row first and then the loop variable over the column, add all of those elements to a running sum, and then once we get that, print it out. So every time we go through and repeat this for every value of I, so in other words for every row, we're going to reinitialize the sum to 0 and then loop to add all of the numbers within that row together. So we're initializing the sum to 0 for every row. Okay, so if we want to do something for every row, the outer loop has to be over the rows. On the other hand, if we want to do something for every column, if we wanted to add each column together, then our outer loop is going to have to be over the columns. So in this case, if we want to sum each column, then the outer loop is going to be over the column. So now I is going to iterate from 1 to the number of columns. We're going to repeat for every value of I. Again, we want to reinitialize a sum to 0 for every one of the columns, initialize the sum to 0, and then loop through all of the rows, where j goes from 1 to row, where we're adding each element in the quiz variable to our running sum. So in this case, I is over the columns, that's the second one. J is over the rows, that's the first one. So we're always giving the index for the row first and the column second, regardless of the order of the actual loops. So again, we're initializing the sum to 0 for every column, and we're always indexing the row first and then the column. So again, row first or column first, it depends on what you want to accomplish. So if we want an overall sum of all of the elements in the two-dimensional array, then it doesn't make any difference whether the outer loop is over the rows or the columns. But one thing we do have to do is we have to initialize our running sum variable to 0 before we start the loops. So we want an overall sum of all of the elements. So before we start the loops, we initialize sum to 0, and then we're going to loop, have our nested loop. In this case, the outer loop goes over the rows and the inner loop goes over the columns, and we're adding each element in our array quiz sub I, comma j, to our running sum. So again, we have to initialize the sum to 0 and then have both of the loops, and it doesn't matter whether we have the outer loop over the rows or the columns. But we do want to initialize the sum to 0 first, and then once we get out of the nested loop, we're going to print the value of the overall sum.